Rebelle is a remarkable new program. It so accurately renders watercolor that honestly you won't believe you're not painting with the real thing. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples of what I mean here. If I take a dry watercolor brush on dry paper, that is exactly what I would expect to get from watercolor. Same thing if I stack two colors side by side, dry on dry, this is absolutely what I would expect to get. But if I change and get a wet watercolor brush and do wet watercolor on dry paper, again, I get exactly the same thing that I would expect to get if I were using the traditional medium. It's amazing. Go one step farther now. Let's do, and I'm going to wet my paper. I can use this button to see if the paper is wet, and this one actually wets the paper. So now I have wet paper, and I'm going to make my brush dry again. Repeat the same procedure. This is wet paper with a dry brush. Lay those two colors down side by side. It's exactly what I would expect from the traditional medium. Here's where I get fascinated. Now I'm going to lay down wet paint on wet paper and watch it diffuse. That is beautiful. It diffuses exactly like it should. What's really cool is though when you can take two colors and lay them down side by side and let them bleed and run into each other or pull one straight across or whatever technique works for you, no matter what you do, it reacts just like traditional watercolor. It is really amazing. The way that this program functions is so realistic. If you've ever painted with watercolor, you're going to be mesmerized and absolutely addicted overnight. It's totally addicting. But one of the things I find most fascinating about Rebelle is that even if you have never touched a watercolor brush in your life, it actually has a pretty small learning curve. You'll be able to pick it up and create beautiful things pretty simply. So don't be intimidated or discouraged if you've never painted before. It's great for everybody. So I'm going to clear out this layer. I want to show you something else. So when traditional watercolorists begin to paint, oftentimes they will tilt their paper to make the paint run. You've got a couple of different options in Rebelle. This is the tilt function. You can pull out any direction of line on the paper itself to indicate the direction that you want to tilt your paper, or you can use the dialog box on the side and go any direction you would like to go. There are two lines. The heavier line indicates the severity of the tilt. So right now we're only tilting the paper a tiny little bit, and now the paper's pretty much being held straight up and down. It's vertical, and the paint's going to run really fast. So if I go back to my watercolor brush and I apply some pigment to the paper, watch how it runs. It runs just like I would expect it to if I were applying wet paint on dry paper. That's incredible. You would think that that would be the extent of the awesomeness, but it's really not. If I wet this paper now, so you can see I've used the show wet feature and my paper is wet, I can not only tilt my paper, I'm going to put a bunch of paint down here. I'm going to tilt the paper, but then I can change the direction on the fly. And I can do that either place. I can do it either in the dialog box on the side or directly on the paper. And I can tell it what direction I want the paint to flow. And you can get some pretty amazing effects, just like you would if you were using a traditional watercolor setup and actually holding the paper in your hand. It's fascinating. Still, we can go one step farther. I'm going to clear my paper once more. I'm going to reduce the tilt just a little bit. I don't want the paint to run quite as fast, but I do still want it to run a little. If I put some paint down on the paper, it's going to run a small amount, but what I want you to observe here is how the paint is interacting with the paper. I didn't do a big tilt. This paper is not heavily textured. I got a reaction from the paper and the paint. You can see that it settled heavier in the bottom, and it also settled into the texture. But what's really cool about Rebelle is you have choices on your paper texture. And I'm just going to jump to a really gritty one just so you can see the effect firsthand. Now look at the paper. You can see that the paint actually will settle into that texture. I'm going to let it run, and you can see if I had a pointer tool, you would be able to see that it settled into each one of those little squares. Is that not cool? If I wet that paper and hit it again with the paint, it's going to run a little bit differently. You can see it ran uphill and downhill, and that's because the paper is not tilted severely. Again, I can tilt the paper on the fly just by swapping over to that tool, make it run really hard, and watch it fill in each of those little squares. So not only does the paper react to the amount of water in the brush, the amount of water on the paper, it also reacts to the tilt of the paper and the texture of the paper. These are things totally unique to Rebelle. And I've just barely scratched the surface of what Rebelle is capable of. I really think you should give it a try. You're going to love it.